So our next speaker is one of our digital PR strategists here at Digitaloft, and it is Abby Bennetts. So Abby takes responsibility for planning, developing and executing digital PR strategies that help our clients to land top-tier links and coverage. And today, Abby's going to be talking about how we can use psychological principles to write better pitch emails. This is a really exciting talk, which I think you will all gain some really great insights from. And yeah, welcome, Abby, and look forward to seeing your session.
Hello. Just go on here. If you can all see my screen, I will get started. So thanks, James. As James said, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Abby Bennetts and I'm a digital PR strategist at Digitaloft. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the psychology of writing great pitch emails. And I've been working in digital PR for about 2 years now, but I actually did my undergraduate degree in psychology. So over the past couple of years, I've been really interested in finding out how psychological principles can help power our digital PR success. So we've got the ideas from Olivia's and Louise's brilliant talks, tough acts to follow, I must say. So we've got how to come up with amazing ideas that land links. But actually, if we're not pitching to journalists, then how are we going to get our amazing campaign ideas out to journalists? So a journalist job then is all about telling great stories, right? So they write stories that hopefully get masses of engagement and interaction from readers online or in print. But our jobs then as digital PRs is to create those stories in the first place and pitch them out and persuade journalists to publish those stories on the publications that they're working at. And actually, we're all natural storytellers. So whether you're relaying your day at work to your partner or you're down the pub telling a funny story to your friends, we all have this innate ability to tell and share stories with other people. And so I think to write great pitches, we need to be great storytellers. We need to be telling the story of our campaigns to journalists in order to persuade them to write about them themselves. And so when I knew I wanted to do a talk about pitches, I decided to look back at some of our really old pitches that we did probably around 3 to 4 years ago. And I'm not outing anyone on the team here because this is by no means a bad pitch. However, I think what was lacking here, when we were talking to the team about this pitch, we said, like the campaign didn't really take off in the way that we wanted to. And I think what is missing here is the lack of story. So sure, we've got a bit of flair. We've got, there ain't no party like a cocktail party. That would interest me for sure. But we haven't got that build up. We haven't got the story of how to shape cocktails step by step and how this is going to make your cocktail taste amazing. And so actually, I think this is where the pitch was lacking. So how can we incorporate storytelling then into our pitches? Well, Marina Plummer from Kaizen actually did a really great talk on this, and I'm not going to get too deep into how storytelling can really help our digital PR strategies. But what I am going to tell you about is a piece of psychological research, which was conducted by researchers called Mazzocco and Green. And basically what they did is they looked into how narratives were persuading juries when it came to trials of crimes. And they found that there are 6 key characteristics that make for persuasive stories. And actually, I think these are really applicable to how we can be writing our pitches. So today, I'm going to be showing you how we can be using these psychological principles to improve our storytelling and help land coverage. So the first key characteristic then of persuasive stories that the researchers talked about was delivery. So I have a picture of James Acaster here because he is my favorite comedian. And like any great comedy set or a great speech, it's as much about the delivery as it is the content itself. So when you're delivering a pitch, journalists are receiving hundreds of very probably similar pitches every single day. So we need to be thinking about how we can make ourselves stand out. And I'm aware that I use this example every single time. So anyone who's watched me talk in the last sort of 3 weeks is probably going to be like, shut up. But it's just so shocking that I went to a conference a couple of years ago and the Mirror's consumer editor at the time said she had 92,000 unread emails in her inbox. And she was basically talking about how she was sifting through these constantly, but actually she was just being bombarded every single day with very similar pitches. So actually, if you're one of the thousands that are emailing a journalist, we need to be grabbing their attention. And actually, according to psychological research, we can use what is called trigger words in our pitches to grab their attention. And trigger words are basically adjectives, so descriptive words. They're really engaging and emotional, and they're examples of words of like amazing, bizarre, essential, weird. So we want to be using these throughout our pitches to engage with the journalists. And actually then, here is an example of a pitch where we've tried to include these trigger words to try and really get the journalists to involve themselves in the story without even clicking on the campaign page. So we've got words such as wanderlust, immerse yourself, incredible photography, whisked away. So it's really engaging with the audience and trying to make them buy into that story. And actually then, web psychologist Natalie Nahai, who again, if you've watched any of my talks, you'll know I'm obsessed with, has written about how we can be using trigger words in our headlines to make them more clickable and make them grab the attention of a journalist when it lands in their inbox. So she's created a formula which basically says that we should be using a number plus a trigger word plus an adjective plus a keyword plus a promise equals a clickable headline. Now, this might sound a bit hard to place when you're reading it. You're probably thinking like, what is going on here? But actually, I did a little bit of research into the headlines of some top tier publications. And it turns out everyone's kind of using this formula. So BuzzFeed are renowned for having clickbait headlines, and they use pretty much this exact formula. So we've got 25 bizarre baby naming stories that you will be thinking about later. So we've got the number, we've got the trigger word, bizarre, naming stories that you'll be thinking about later, a promise. And then even with more, less clickbaity publications like The Independent or Reader's Digest, we've got top 10 essential stationery for students and 10 unbelievable ways to look after your eyes. So actually then, with our pitches, it's much about the delivery and the words that we're using as it is the content itself that we're pitching. And you can be referring to Natalie Nahai's formula to create those clickable headlines that catch the attention of a journalist. So the second key characteristic of persuasive stories that the researchers talked about was imagery. Now, psychological studies have shown time and time again that the brain literally lights up when reacting to imagery. So people are shown pictures or images and the whole parts of the brain are literally going crazy. And for anyone who's a visual thinker, you'll know that to be true. Me, myself, I am a visual thinker, and you can probably tell this because when I'm trying to think of stuff, I'm constantly looking around for visual stimuli to try and get my ideas going. So actually then, we need to be using images in our pitches, because not only does it break up all the text of the information of the campaign that you're pitching, but it also really stimulates the brains of our audiences. So I'd recommend always linking to a Dropbox folder of high-res images. So firstly, individual images of your campaign. So if you've got a interactive campaign, then I'd recommend cutting that down into stills so that journalists can use that to support the feature that they're writing up. And obviously if it's static, then you'll already have the high-res graphics ready to go. And anyone who's, a digital PR will know that journalists have at least maybe 2 or 3 images per feature. So actually, if you're already sending over those images, you're not just engaging with the audience better, you're also making your journalist life so much easier. So as well as images of your campaign, it can be really great to include images of the places or the people or the objects that your campaign is about. So for example, if we go back to the Instagram travel guide pitch that I just showed you, one of the angles that we had within this research was all about the top 10 Instagram beaches. So why not go and find the pictures of the top 10 most Instagram beaches? We already know that this is going to be a visual campaign. Like, people can't travel at the moment. They want to see these glorious beaches. So actually including those images in your pitch is going to make for a much more persuasive story in a journalist's mind. So just a note here to check for copyright. You don't want to get journalists into trouble because then they'll hate you and it will just be stress. So make sure that a journalist can reuse an image editorially, and tools such as Shutterstock and the usage rights filter on Google Images is really good to check this. And then if you can't get an image that can be reused in an editorial way, then don't hesitate to provide journalists with Instagram links. So this I find is really good for people-focused campaigns or campaigns that involve social media, because actually it's still a way to provide imagery without having to use those rubbish images. So imagery then, the brain lights up when it's shown images, so it's important to provide images in your pitches for journalists to use. And these Dropbox folders are not only going to be engaging with the audience and the journalists, but it's also going to make a journalist's life easier. But just check the usage guidelines and then provide Instagram links when possible. So the third key characteristic of persuasive stories then is realism. And this basically means that the human mind is able to relate and absorb stories so much better when there is a human element that an audience can picture in their mind. So we can add this realism and relatability to our stories by using expert quotes or case studies. So I have an example here of a campaign that we launched for a cosmetics client. And this was all about the Google searches, a classic, of beauty treatments at home. And this was launched during lockdown. So obviously all the salons are closed. No one can get out to have their brows done, their nails done, their hair done. It was a horrible time to be a female. And this campaign was taking a little bit slower to take off than we wanted to. So we had to try and really place ourselves in the minds of the audience. If they're searching for these beauty treatments, like how to do your brows, how to do your nails at home, then you're probably going to be looking for a really great answer to this, right? So this is where we got an expert on board and we created a brow guide. And this basically took the consumers, the audience, through every single step to doing perfect brows at home. And we pitched this out, and this got so much coverage, so many links, because it was really tapping into that human element of our audience. Like, obviously everyone's going to be stressing, well, maybe not obviously, they have bigger things to worry about, but people were concerned about how to do their eyebrows at home. And so this is why I think this comment really enhanced the campaign, because it was really tapping into that realism of the reality of people at that time. So we can be using case studies and expert comments then to add insightful commentary or useful advice. And not only does it do this, it represents the brand and places them as real experts, like they're really tapping into the needs of a consumer at a really important time. And actually this enables the audience to connect so much more with the story, rather than just seeing it and thinking, oh, this is clearly a PR campaign, or this is clearly a link building campaign. So realism then, people relate to stories much easier when there is a human element. So you can use expert comments in your pitches to position your client as experts, and include case studies to help your audience connect with the story so much more. So the fourth element of having a persuasive story then is structure. And people tend to prefer stories that follow a logical manner, which makes total sense, right? If someone was telling you a story and they started in the middle and then they maybe jumped to the beginning and then to the end again, you'd be like, what's going on? Like, it just doesn't make sense. So what I'd recommend here then is when you're writing your story or your pitch, cut the waffle and drop the journalist straight into the beginning of your campaign story. So I have an example here. It's actually the same example that Olivia used in her earlier talk. And basically the campaign looked into Spotify data to see which were the most popular working from home songs. So with the pitch then, we went straight into the research and looked at the who, the what, the how, and the why. So straight off, we're telling journalists who's done the research, the client, what they've done. So they've delved into 50,000 songs across 400 playlists, and the why. So they've done this because they want to see what people are listening to whilst they're working from home. And I think I remember whenever I do my first intro line, I always think of what Alex Cassidy said at Outreach Conference once, was that the first line should always be, I think it was the sentence that you'd say if you'd run up a hill and you only had one breath left. So always bear that in mind. You want to be really concise, you want to be really short, but tell the journalist what you've been doing. So actually then when it comes to structuring your pitch, I follow a mnemonic that I made up. And because I live for the links, this mnemonic reads, obtaining links can truly cause immense excitement. And this basically means that every pitch I write, I try to include an opening line, a long link, some context, a top 10, a comment or a quote, some images, because we know how important images are, and some extra info. So when looking at an actual pitch then, what does this look like? Well, with the business comparison example then, we've got the opening line. So this is the short, concise, one-liner, elevator pitch line that you would tell a journalist what your client has done with your campaign. Then we've got the long link, so always have it as a long URL rather than linking out on a brand mention, because we don't know how journalists are reading our pitches. They might be reading on their mobile phones, and actually this just makes it a lot easier to click through. So then we've got the context. So then here I would always try and pop in a line about why should this story be covered right now in the current climate? So for this campaign then, it was all of us are working from home during the coronavirus pandemic, and we're all struggling a bit. We're all learning how to work productively and effectively in a new environment. And actually, for some people, like Olivia, listening to a banging playlist is the perfect way to increase your productivity. So there's your context, and then I would get straight into the top 10 or a bottom 10 or a table of some sort. It doesn't have to be ranked necessarily, but this just lays out the data really clearly for journalists to automatically know what they're writing their story about without having to delve into the campaign URL and go scrolling through loads of data. Because, if journalists are receiving hundreds and hundreds of pitches a day, they don't have time to do that. So then below the top 10 or the data table, I'd pop in some extra info. So this could be any additional angles or methodology information that you haven't already put in the pitch. And then finally then we've got the comment. So this could add value, this could add the advice, like we had with the Cosmetify example. And then finally the images, because we know that images are going to engage much more with the audience and just make a journalist's life much easier. So structure then, we prefer to follow stories that have a logical structure. So cut the faff in the first few lines and just place journalists straight into the beginning of that story and take them through how you've done the research on what the key stories from that campaign are. And then follow the mnemonic. Obtaining links can truly cause immense excitement. You don't have to do that, but it helps me. So the fifth principle then of creating a persuasive story is context. So context can have a really significant impact on the persuasiveness of a story. So the researchers that did this initial research said that if the teller of a story comes off as being genuine, incompetent, or as unlikable, it can have an adverse effect on the story itself. And I actually really related to this because I have a friend who is literally the female version of Jay from The Inbetweeners. She just chats shit all the time. So if she's ever telling a story, I'm automatically thinking like, is this real? Is this genuine? Is this legit? And so actually when it comes to pitching journalists, if you're not coming off as competent or confident, then they're automatically going to be doubting the research that you're sending them. So quite simple advice here, but make sure that you're being friendly and genuine. Check your tone. You don't want to come off as being sarcastic or, not caring enough. And get colleagues to double check pitches for typos, links, and general formatting things, especially if you're using tools such as BuzzSumo or other email sending tools, because sometimes that can mess it all up. And again, if journalists are reading emails that are just formatted a bit rubbish, then they're less likely to take the time to read through your campaign. So actually then context can go so much more than, being friendly and being legit. It's all about being aware of how the wider news cycle can affect how your story might be received. So I've popped a few examples here. So we've got news events. So for example, if you have a travel campaign and we're in the midst of a travel ban because of the coronavirus pandemic, then you might not want to send that pitch to the country where they have a travel ban. Or on the other hand, if you've got a national holiday coming up, so Christmas, and you've got a campaign about gift giving, then that might actually be the perfect time to pitch your story, because the wider context of the news cycle means that people are going to want to read it more. And then I've just put national days here, not the stupid ones, which is kind of a note to self, because when I first started out in the industry, I think I took every national day as an opportunity to try and pitch in a campaign. But actually, I think you just need to use your common sense here, because if you've got like National Pizza and Ketchup Day, which probably does exist because there's a national day for everything, then if journalists aren't writing about that and people aren't going to engage with that and relate to that, then it's probably not the best time to hook into your campaign with that day. So we have context then. Context can really affect how persuasive a story is. So make yourself seem competent, be confident, be likable, and be aware of how the wider news cycle can affect your story and how it can be perceived. So finally then, the researchers said that obviously your audience is going to really affect how persuasive the story that you're telling is going to be. So what I'd recommend here is getting to know your audience. So again, going back to Natalie Nahai's book, Webs of Influence, She says that we tend to trust and like those who are similar to ourselves. So what you can do when you're writing your pitches is mirror the tone and language of your audience, because this means that your message is likely to be more well received. So actually, when we're writing our pitches, we need to be speaking to them in their own language. So what I'd recommend here then is read how the journalist and publication writes their headlines and craft your headline in a similar way. So as we saw with using the trigger words in your headlines, if you know that BuzzFeed is going to use that formula, then why not craft your headline in the same way? Because it means that there's more chance that they're going to use it in their actual feature. And it also means that they're more likely to pick it out of a bunch when they're scrolling through their inbox. So again, then, speaking their language when it comes to just the general body of the pitch. So use words that journalists use to mirror their dialect and appear more similar. Now, what I'd say here is that it's obviously quite hard because everyone has their own dialect. So actually, I think this to a certain extent means getting to know the journalists themselves and building a relationship. But actually what's quite important to bear in mind here is that if you're pitching to journalists in other countries, you might want to change your slang words or certain phrases or, cultural sayings. These are all going to be different in different countries. So just bear that in mind when you're writing your pitches. And then finally then, take note of how publications write their stories and lay your pitch out in a similar way. So as an example then, this is a recent piece of coverage that we landed on Insider for a campaign which looked at the earnings per minute of the world's biggest sports stars. And basically anyone who's read the Insider or landed coverage on Insider will know that they tend to adopt this sort of layout of a name and the number and then an image and sort of a scrolly list basically. So why not format your pitch like this? Not only, again, is this going to capture the attention of the journalist who writes for Insider, but it also means that it makes their job so much easier when it comes to writing the feature up. So audience then, we trust and like people who are similar to us. So you can mirror your audience by reading how journalists write and then replicating this in your pitch. So in conclusion then, there are 6 key characteristics of persuasive stories according to psychological research. And I think we can actually really be tapping into these in our pitches. So just to recap then, we've got delivery. So use those emotional trigger words to help us deliver our stories more effectively. Then we've got imagery. So provide imagery with every single campaign pitch to enhance our storytelling and make journalists' lives easier. Then we've got realism, which is all about using case studies and expert comments to enhance the realism of our stories. Then we've got structure, so that's laying out your pitches in a clear and easy to read format and presenting the story in a logical manner that means journalists can follow it. And then we've got context, so that's all about making yourself likable to get the best chance of journos liking your story and thinking about how your content can be hooked into the news cycle and how this might affect how the story is being perceived. And then finally then we've got audience, so get to know your audience, the journalists, and mirror the way they talk and write in your pitch emails. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Abby. And yeah, really, really great session and with some real actionable insights. And I mean, I've got the luxury of working with you every day. I see this every day, and every time I watch one of your talks, I learn something new. I've been doing this for quite a while, and every time I learn something new. And so I hope everybody who's joined us is walking away with so many ideas on how to improve their pitches. I think we all know that a pitch it can make or break the success of a campaign, and understanding how a journalist perceives the pitch that they receive it's just so important. And the questions are flooding in. So the first one that we've had in is, do you put images into the body of an email? In that they've always been told that it's a surefire way to go into someone's junk or spam folder.
Yeah, so I think journalists typically always say try to avoid using attachments because it is more likely to end up in their junk box. But I think if you've got a campaign that is really visually led, so for example, we created a campaign that was, if cars had been well, you'll know it, James, if cars had been created by tech companies and it was illustrations, and actually I think that's where the illustrations were almost the key selling point of the story. So you're going to want to include that in the email. And in that instance, I think that's where it's appropriate to pop in images in the body of the email. But yeah, generally, I'd probably use a Dropbox folder over inline attachments.
Yeah, fantastic. And then the next question, Abby, is within your outreach email, do you attach a press release, or is the body of the email the release? Interested if other PRs are avoiding press release creation as a modern approach.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of been discussions quite a lot about this recently. We, as a general rule, tend to not. We try to include everything a journalist could need in the pitch and sort of avoid the traditional press release format unless the client would like us to do that. And then what we tend to do is have a press release on file, waiting if a journalist needed extra info or needed, you know, a write-up or some copy. But yeah, as a general rule, we'd probably try to include everything in the body of the email itself.
Fantastic. It was really great. And I think the last question that we've had come in is how many contacts are usually in your media list for outreach?
I feel like I've had a few talks over the last few
Yeah.
weeks, and there's always one question that I have to go, it depends, which is such an
Yeah.
annoying answer, but
Such an SEO answer, Abby.
It is. I'm a true SEO at heart. But I think, as we all probably know, campaigns sometimes can take off within a day, and other times they need a bit more work. They need re-angling. They need repitching. So it kind of depends on the campaign and how quickly it takes off in the first instance.
Absolutely. And then there's two from me, actually. And the first one is, what's your take on building relationships with journalists? I mean, I know one of the questions I often get when speaking to our clients is, do relationships matter? Can you land coverage on a publication if you haven't got a relationship with a journalist? So I'd love your take on that.
Yeah, I think when I started out, I was quite set on building. I've talked about before, like I was so set on having like those 20 contacts that would give me like links coverage every single time. And actually, as I said, like journalists are receiving so many pitches from PRs. We outweigh journalists by so much. They don't have the time to be building those relationships. So I think relationships can obviously help, particularly if they write about one particular topic and your client can actually provide insight or campaigns on that again and again. But actually, a lot of the coverage that we land is without prior relationships. So actually, that's where, you know, the great ideas and
fantastic. Brilliant. And then the last one, which I am asking everybody, is what's your favorite campaign that you've worked on and why?
I know, I'm glad you said that when you asked me.
Yeah?
I've had some time to think about that.
Yeah, I've given you a bit of time.
Yeah. So I think that my favorite campaign that I've worked on was a campaign that we did, which looked at the Instagram earnings of the Too Hot to Handle cast. And I think it's my favorite because it's not necessarily, you know, the most crazy campaign, but I thought about it whilst I was watching the TV show on the weekend and then was able to come in the next week. And it was sort of the first campaign that at Digitaloft that I'd really worked with and outreach myself, and it did really well. And actually, it was just before all the Instagram earnings was taking off. So yeah, it was one of my favourites to work on so far.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Abby. That was absolutely brilliant. There's questions. Twitter is buzzing. So yeah, I'm sure you'll respond to any other questions that do come in. But thank you very much for that. And it was great to have you